In the spring of 1964, the New York Times ran a murder story on the newspaper's front page. The headline didn't describe the crime itself, however. It read, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. Apathy at stabbing of Queenswoman shocks inspector. And it wasn't just the inspector who was shocked by the story. Letters to the editor of outrage and despair poured into the New York Times and media outlets across the country. The main takeaway from citizens and talking heads was that cities transformed people into anonymous strangers who could look out only for themselves in the concrete jungle. The 1960s had already seen increased scrutiny of American cities as the financial fallout of white flight began hitting urban landscapes hard, and the incessant moral panics of post-war middle-class America painted cities as modern Sodom and Gomorrahs. In more progressive circles, books of the decade like Jane Jacobs' iconic 1961 work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, lamented how modern city planning was destroying the diversity and humanity of neighborhoods across the country. 60 years later, Americans living in urban areas are still less likely than their suburban and rural countrymen to say they'd trust a neighbor with a set of keys or turn to for support, and more likely to say that they are fearful of crime in their area. Is all this pessimism around the state of cities inevitable? Do cities just by their very essence bring out the worst of human nature, creating communities that are lonelier and more cynical? Despite the prevalence of this narrative in media and the news, researchers, architects, and community organizers across the globe are bringing a renewed challenge to this idea and showing how cities can bring out the best in us. One of the most important elements in promoting pro-social behavior in cities is simply encouraging more people to form relationships and social circles in their local community. When it comes to cities, and American cities specifically, utilizing more transitional spaces and public amenities is key to creating the chance encounters and repeat meetings that create urban relationships. These public spaces are urban areas where people can rest and congregate that are neither work nor private homes, such as parks, coffee shops, and building courtyards, all of which encourage congregation or people simply stopping for a moment. Creating these visible public spaces where people meet others who live, work, or relax in the same area makes citizens more trusting of neighbors who are no longer strangers, but partners in conversation and gossip at the park or church function. While only about 60% of residents in low-amenity suburbs say that they trust their neighbors at all, over 3/4 of residents in high-amenity neighborhoods say they trust their neighbors to a high degree. High and low amenity areas here are designated by the Neighborhood Amenities Index, which assesses neighborhoods based on the variety and proximity of commercial, civic, and green space areas. These amenities are variable, and each interacts with its community slightly differently, but there are some key common similarities. For instance, the most effective amenities tend to demand some aspect of civic responsibility and belonging. Houses of worship that need volunteers, public libraries that need supporters, or even local coffee shops that reinvest in the neighborhood all keep activity, and in the later example, funds, local, as well as asking people to imagine themselves as part of a community with local institutions rather than customers at a collection of fast food chains and big box stores on the state highway. Yet this is not SimCity, and if you build it, people will not necessarily come. The real question is how can amenities be integrated into an area so that people will actually use them and come to view their neighbors as part of their community. The modern city's public spaces and brick-and-mortar stores are not just in competition with greener pastures in the suburbs, but with the internet and other forms of mass media that keep people's lives centered around their living rooms and backyards rather than out in the community. Getting people out into the community not only builds connections inherently, but when done right, public spaces can reduce the stress and anxiety of urban dwellers, further promoting positive social behavior. Stress and anxiety are chronic in urban spaces, partially as a result of the increased noise, crowds, and grime of many modern cities. Environmental stressors not only make public places like parks and plazas less pleasant, but can affect how people act after interacting with them. Those experiencing chronic stress from living in a constantly irritating environment are more likely to withdraw from social situations and can be more hostile with strangers. In the context of creating better social behavior, this harms both the creation of community and pushes both newcomers and area natives away from unpleasant public places and people. Creating stress-free and stress-reducing public places is therefore a cornerstone to building a more generous and friendly city. The most obvious route comes from a movement that has been gaining significant traction and attention online recently, which is the problem of cars in cities. Cars not only create stressors indirectly through their shocking contribution to city noise and stench, but also directly by creating dangerous roads and anonymous obstacles to be avoided when navigating city blocks. In addition to removing cars, regular street cleaning and better garbage collection helps to improve the smell and look of urban landscapes, which can weigh on its residents over time. While not quite as sexy as the anti-car movement, little changes like more regular street cleaning can make a big difference to the state of mind of urban dwellers. The second major path towards reducing stress is placing an emphasis on true green space in our cities. Since Roman times, the concept of jus in urbe was recognized as an important way to mediate the noise and filth that comes with a city, and that need has only increased as horse carts have graduated to SUVs. While for many Romans, jus in urbe might have primarily meant private gardens and sprawling villas, modern green spaces thrive due to their ability to bring calm and sanctuary to all residents of a city, with some notable exceptions I'll explore later. In New York City, we are close to getting more concrete data on the effects of increased green space and decreased tarmac. Eric Adams, mayor of the famously busy and angry city, has adopted plans by the 25 by 25 campaign to increase pedestrian areas and green space by converting street space. In addition, the $900 million plan takes on other urban irritants like trash by investing in secure trash storage to reduce the city's practice of leaving trash bags on the sidewalk for collection. Already, pilots have shown promising results for getting more people to sit out with their neighbors. While there is far to go in making cityscapes more calm, the Big Apple has already rolled back some of the pedestrian streets it established during the pandemic. There are promising signs that not only is it happening, but even in a city like New York, known for its cynicism, making neighborhoods pleasant can make altruists out of the toughest New Yorker. While everyone benefits from better public spaces, and some groups benefit more than others, a particularly relevant case is how children benefit greatly from better public spaces and urban communities. Even before the pandemic, American children were becoming lonelier and lonelier each year, correlated with increases in mental health struggles and suicides. The pandemic has only exacerbated these issues and further demonstrated the importance of accessible public spaces outside of just their schools and homes. Both independence and connection with peers are vital parts of a child's development, yet both have been reined back over the past few decades in North America. Some causes like over-reliance on technology and fear-mongering about kidnappings contribute to this, but so too does increasingly hostile and dangerous streets, which create a self-fulfilling loop that keeps kids inside. Children and teenagers who are able to act more independently also tend to have higher self-esteem and are more capable of tackling life's problems as they grow older. In addition, while they're growing up, independence gives children greater access to peer interactions, which not only staves off the growing trend of youth isolation, but also builds experience interacting with peers without the specter of teachers and parents present. In order for kids to be granted this necessary and regular independence outside of the home, parents must feel that their kids will be safe both in transit to their location and at the location itself. Making transit infrastructure more welcoming to children and teenagers could involve cleaner and more frequent bus service or protected bicycling infrastructure. However, the key element comes at the neighborhood level. The need for what is often called eyes on the streets makes parents comfortable that their kids are looked out for, or at least can turn to someone when in trouble. Eyes on the streets is stereotypically the image of a small town in which everyone knows everyone, and so kids can play in the street or bike to a store because their parents feel comfortable that neighbors are keeping an eye on them. However, this is not about city size. It all comes back to trust. The strongest urban communities are those where the perceptive stranger versus neighbor axis has tilted so much that parents don't need to worry about tracking their kids' every movement because there is always an adult around they can turn to. In places like Scandinavia or Japan, where social trust has survived better even in large cities, groups of kids can often be seen spending time together after school, and individual children sit side by side with commuters on trains as they run errands or go to visit a friend. Here, however, I would like to add a quick note on exoticization in politics. This is a subject I'd like to explore in a later video, but there is a tendency, in American politics especially, to dismiss the lessons of other countries because of supposed cultural differences. Supposedly, either because a country is so homogeneous, which is very rarely even the case, or they have some magic word in their language that allows them to conceptualize community or coziness differently, like the Dutch Nixon or Danish Hygge, their societies are more trusting or more practical. This is, of course, pop psych nonsense, but nonetheless, when talking about the independence of children outside of North America, these arguments are constantly evoked. Many European countries, like the Netherlands, also went through periods where their streets were less safe, but rather than locking their kids inside, they made their streets safer and more practical. The United States can take the same steps too if we stop thinking of ourselves as too unique to learn anything from others. One last note as well here on politics and culture. One country that typifies many of the ideals I've espoused thus far, well-kept streets, plentiful urban green spaces, and neighborhoods with diverse locations, nonetheless suffers from high rates of loneliness, depression, and suicide. Once again, armchair anthropologists point to Japan's social culture as somehow to blame, and certainly this may lead to fewer people reaching out for help. But the Japanese have some of the longest working hours in the world, and intense pressure to focus on work and academics rather than social communities and time away. In this failure, we can learn that no architectural design or urban plan will single-handedly solve workplace depression. People need the time from work or the relief of pressure from school to get out and enjoy great places. A beautiful but unvisited garden helps nobody. While the conversation around urban spaces today centers around getting people out into public spaces, much of the focus of American urban design for many decades has been how to get people, particularly the poor and homeless, out of public spaces. Building true community centers begins with confronting the many interests still pushing for such hostile policies, as well as rolling back the years of hostile architecture and construction that pervades our cities. It is easy to recognize these as a barrier to the poor and marginalized participating in their communities. In addition to physically keeping them out of certain opportunities, it also sends the message that they are not welcome. However, these methods designed to harm specific members of society end up making everyone lonelier and more cynical. In preventing people from loitering by removing or frustrating sitting, people of all backgrounds are less likely to spend time in public, and particularly are less likely to feel conversational with a stranger from their neighborhood. When highways divide up cities, it is not only those from disadvantaged neighborhoods that suffer as a result, but anybody interested in getting out of their bubble or simply having a quieter and more pleasant-smelling city. In general, the practice of neglecting and antagonizing public spaces in the hopes that the poor will avoid them pushes everyone away and into their homes or workplaces. Ironically, this is why gated communities like the Villages in Florida often have well-kept and lively community centers. When gates and a private company keep people out, then designers feel comfortable making cities pleasant to loiter in and greet people. Of course, more targeted exclusion cannot be the solution to an exclusive city. Not only does it harm the excluded, but it dulls the diversity of background and belief that attracts so many people to cities in the first place today. Fighting back against hostile architecture, as with many solutions, is a local activity. Some take a more active approach, such as a French man who was arrested by authorities for removing the superfluous third armrest on benches in a local park that were designed to prevent people sleeping there overnight. He rightly asked what message it sends about how people view their own society if the homeless aren't even given the dignity of sleeping on benches at night. Community action doesn't have to be quite so confrontational, however. Coming back to New York City for a moment, citizens on one street that was temporarily closed from motor traffic during the pandemic created the straightforwardly named 34th Avenue Open Streets Coalition. Not only do they advocate for the extension of a program that has energized and connected their neighborhood, but members take shifts with community needs like putting up and taking down barriers, weeding the grass medians, and running the street's weekly food pantry. In addition, the increased feeling of community identity has helped the coalition to raise $20,000 for needs in the community. Other solutions just require getting more involved with town and local decision makers. Fear of promoting crime or drug use has quickly led to towns shutting down or never building public bathrooms and other public amenities because nobody who cares about these issues was sitting on those councils or paying attention to their decisions. If you're concerned about alienation in American cities, as I hope you are at this point, watching YouTube videos and reading blogs on why European city centers are so much better than American ones won't help you or your city to become more social and community-oriented. Community advocacy groups not only work towards connecting more neighbors by their work, but also in their very existence, helping you to meet neighbors passionate about the same issues as you simply by joining. Simply being concerned with your community and those in it push back against dehumanizing the neighborhood and turn strangers into neighbors. As important as those initiatives are, we should first return to the question that I haven't really asked yet in this video. Do cities really make us worse people? Is our nature that malleable? I'd like to return to the first case I discussed in this video, the stabbing of Kitty Genovese, the Queens woman with the apparently apathetic neighbors. At the beginning of the video, I presented the case as it had been published at the time, and has been talked about since, one in which nearly 40 people understood a murder was occurring, but were too uncaring to do anything. This portrayal is simply false, as is the idea that humans become wholly unfeeling strangers when placed in an urban context. Few people in the building understood what was happening, and those who did actually made multiple phone calls to the police. One came to the stairwell to investigate, and one neighbor held Kitty Genovese in her arms while waiting for police to arrive. People cared, and still today, people care. The question we should be asking, therefore, is not really, can cities make us better people? As interesting as the psychology is behind environments and architecture, their effects are minuscule in comparison to millions of years of evolutionary programming. Perhaps the better question is, can cities make us feel like people are better? To that question, the factors I've discussed give a more definite answer of yes. With less environmental stresses, connecting with people to see their humanity becomes easier and more pleasant, particularly when public spaces are numerous and accessible. Lovely, generous people walk by us on the streets every day. The more opportunities we get to stop and find that out, the better we'll feel, and the better communities we'll create. Coming to this conclusion and supporting it has brought me across all sorts of disciplines that study human life, and down many more alleys and rabbit holes than I was able to include in this video. On this channel moving forward, I'd like to continue to explore this intersection of psychology, sociology, anthropology, and the many other ologies I find interesting that explore the complexities of human life and society. If that sounds interesting to you as well, subscribe below. I'll see you in the next video.